My name is Deepak Barua. I'm faculty at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Pune, and I'm primarily a plant ecophysiologist. I study plant function and how it relates to the environments that plants live in. Today I'm going to introduce to you some topics related to global warming and climate change, more specifically with global warming, and talking about the biological impacts of global warming. So right at the beginning, this picture I have on my first slide shows you temperatures taken a couple of months ago, maybe around 3 months ago, July 5th of this year, where the Earth was hitting record temperatures globally at many different places. So this is true not just globally, but also specifically for us in India. Here showing you temperatures on the 19th of May a couple of years ago, where we recorded the highest temperatures ever seen in India of 51 degrees in Rajasthan. And this is true not just of temperatures but also of rainfall and drought, showing you here a slide of drought globally. And again, like with temperatures, this is also true not just for the rest of the globe but also for India. So with this very quick introduction to these record high temperatures that we've been seeing and the accompanying drought that we're beginning to see, I'll want to introduce you to the content of what I will be talking about today. So I'll start off with a very quick introduction to what climate change and global warming is, and a little bit about the predicted future climates and the general impacts of climate change and global warming. I do want to stress that this particular talk will not be covering details of global warming and climate change. I really want to stress on the biological impacts of this change, but I will quickly go through what global warming and climate change is and what the general predictions for the future are and the general impacts for this are. With that, I will talk more specifically about the biological impacts of climate change, talking about the close relationship that plants and animals have with their climate, how they respond to changes in the climate in terms of their function and performance. I will try to contrast climate change versus other anthropogenic drivers of change that we're seeing and how these affect ecosystems. And finally, a little bit about the impact of climate change on tropical systems, and particularly I'll introduce some information we have about forests and trees in India, and finish off with trying to appreciate how a lot of these effects are complex and affect biological systems at all levels of organization. So to quickly introduce climate change for you, I'm going to start off with these two videos.
Accurate measurements of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere began in 1958. A young American chemist, Charles David Keeling, invented the instrument to measure CO2. He installed his instrument in an observatory near the Peak of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. The first few years of measurements showed CO2 levels inexorably rising. Research by Keeling established that the rise in CO2 was due entirely to human causes, primarily the burning of fossil fuels. Superimposed on this rise was an annual fluctuation in which CO2 levels decreased slightly in the spring and increased again in the fall. Here you can see that annual fluctuation that Keeling discovered. This is due to the activities of plants, which photosynthesize in the spring when they put out leaves and draw down the amount of CO2 in the air. The carbon of the carbon dioxide in the air is converted to plant material. In the autumn, when the leaves fall and decompose, the carbon is returned to the air. So what you can see in this graph is what we might call the breathing of the world of plants. But the dominant feature of this graph is the relentless rise from 314 parts per million when Keeling's measurements began to more than 400 parts per million today. Keeling's work is now carried on by other scientists who have installed similar instruments around the world.
Did you know that the Earth's average temperature has risen over 1 degree Fahrenheit in the past century? It might not sound like much, but think about it this way. A 1 degree rise in your body temperature can lead to a fever. 5 degrees can land you in the hospital. So guess what? Our Earth has a fever, and scientists believe Earth's temperature could rise by 3 to 10 degrees this century. Why? For one thing, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They raise the temperature by trapping heat. And warmer temperatures means, you guessed it, less snow and ice. As they melt, what's left behind are darker patches of land and water. And guess what dark colors do? Here's a hint. Ever try wearing black clothes to the beach? Not a good idea. Black absorbs more sunlight, thus emits more heat and makes you warmer. Not good for you or the Earth. Here are some other possible symptoms of planetary fever: shrinking glaciers, shifting plant and animal ranges, sea level rise, more intense heat waves, stronger hurricanes. Experiencing any of these symptoms? It's time to seek attention right away. Remember, the planet you save may be your own.
So with that, you can see that the climate has been changing, temperatures have been increasing. This is primarily being driven by the increased amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we recognize now also that the causes of this change are indeed anthropogenic or caused by human activities. So we understand now that global warming is unequivocal. You can see on the top panel in the slide over here that from 1850 to current times in 2000, temperatures have increased by around a degree centigrade, and accompanying that there has been a rise in sea levels and also a reduction in the snow cover shown here for the northern hemisphere. So scientists have also been trying to understand how these increases are going to continue in coming times, and here from the IPCC 2007 report, predictions based on many different models and based on different scenarios for change show us that the likely change in the next century by the end of 2100 will be in the range of around a degree to greater than 4 degrees centigrade. So the best case scenario is that if we stop pumping carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, the next 100 years we'll likely see an increase in global mean temperatures in the range of 1 degree. In the worst case scenario, this could be as high as 3 to 6 degrees greater than current temperatures. In addition to the increase in mean temperature, it's also important to appreciate that this varies geographically across the globe. The effects of future climate change, the degree increase in temperature, are predicted to be much higher in the polar regions than in the tropics. Shown here is a quick diagram which highlights some of the general impacts of climate change and increased temperatures. We might not appreciate that 1 degree centigrade increase in mean temperatures, the consequences that it might have. So shown here for availability of food and crops, for availability of water, effects on ecosystems, extreme weather events, and the risks of irreversible changes. With a 1 degree increase in temperature, we'll already start seeing significant effects on crop yields. We'll start seeing and are already seeing the disappearance of glaciers, damage to coral reefs. With greater than 1 degree increase, you are going to see a significant increase in the number of species that are going to face extinction, the intensity, severity of extreme climatic events, and with a 2 degree increase in temperature, we will start seeing changes which will take us down the road of non-reversible changes due to climate change. So this is with a 1 and 2 degree increase. With 3, 4, and 5 degrees, the effects and impacts are going to be much more severe and dramatic. In addition to the increase in mean temperatures, it's also important to appreciate that future climates are going to have significantly greater extreme temperature events. Shown here on the left hand side is the current climate, and this will shift to the right, the distribution shown on the right hand side, for predicted future climates, and shown in the red area is exposure that organisms might have to extreme temperatures where they're going to be more stressed out and vulnerable to these extreme climatic conditions. So it's important that in addition to mean temperatures, the exposure to extreme temperatures is going to be much greater in future climates. So with that very quick introduction to climate change, I'll focus more on the biological impacts of global warming on organisms. It's now over a century that we have been researching and understanding the close relationship that all organisms have, both plants and animals, to the climates that they live in. And disruption of this relationship because of changing climates will ultimately affect organisms in many different ways, primarily changing their physiology, reducing their performance and reproductive yield, and ultimately their abundance. Organisms may try to counter this by changing the timings in which they are most active, the study of phenology, or by changing the distributions by migrating to climates that are more suitable for them. Ultimately, though, these will lead to extinctions, both locally and possibly ultimately globally, changes in species interactions, changes in community composition, and also ecosystem function, the properties at the level of entire ecosystems. There are two studies which have been really influential in confirming that climate change is already having an effect on biological systems. I'm going to very quickly introduce these two studies to you. The first one, by a group of authors led by Walther, looked at many different things, but amongst one of the things that they showed was the changes in phenology, which is the timing of recurring biological events in organisms. And shown here in this nice colorful graph is the phenology of spring arrival of migratory birds, shown in pink, the hatching of birds, shown in red, and phenology of certain plant species, shown in the green over there. Below that, we also see in blue the temperatures in March, April, and May, and the northern Atlantic oscillations. What's interesting in these results that they show here are A, we see a decreasing trend in terms of the days when some of these phenological events that were studied were observed, and that this is very closely related to the temperatures in these regions. In addition, this study also looked at the number of invasive species, exotic species in an alpine region in Europe, and they showed that from 1900s to 2000, the number of invasive species increased as the number of frost days decreased in this region. With increasing temperatures and decreasing frost days, we see a sharp increase in the number of invasive and exotic species that were seen in this region. The other very important study around the same time, around the beginning of this century, by Parmesan and Yohe, was a meta-analysis which looked at results from over 1,700 different species, which included both plants, animals, fungi, insects, etc., and showed that in these studies there was a significant increase in the distribution of species. So approximately 6 kilometers movement northward towards the poles in the northern hemisphere, or movement 6 meters upwards in altitude, and also spring phenology, the timing of events in northern temperate regions, to greater than 2 days earlier for every decade. So both of these studies together confirmed for us that the expected results that we predicted with respect to distribution of species, movement of species, and changes in the timing of events, the phenology of plants and animals, were already happening as a response to the changing temperatures that we've been seeing since pre-industrial times. Now, an important question to ask is, how do these effects of climate change compare with other anthropogenic and human-induced disturbance effects on biological systems? This study again around the beginning of the century, estimated the relative effect of different drivers of global biodiversity decline for the year 2100. The first panel on the left, you can see that they show that land use is likely to be a lot more important than possibly climate change in driving negative effects in biodiversity decline globally. However, it's also important to recognize, as they've shown in the smaller panels on the right, that this is going to be very different for different biomes and ecosystems. For example, on the top left, if you concentrate on the Arctic region, the primary driver of change in Arctic regions is likely to be climate change and global warming. In contrast to that, in tropical areas where we are, the land use changes are going to be much more important and global warming likely to be a lot less important. So this was our understanding of the relative importance of global warming relative to other drivers that might also negatively affect biodiversity in the early 2000s. But since then, a lot more studies have shown that organisms in the tropics may be a lot more vulnerable to global warming than those in temperate regions. I show you here two different studies. The one on the left looked at invertebrates, insects across different latitudes, and looked at the change in relative fitness in these insects, predicted and estimated changes in relative fitness in these insects in the next 100 years, approximately 100 years. And what they found is that the effects were negative for species from tropical regions, but were actually positive for those from insects from the northern and southern temperate regions. So this showed that the effects on ectothermic insects are going to be different and are likely to be more severely negative for tropical regions and may actually be positive for some temperate insects. A similar study more recently from plants showed that again, plants from the northern temperate regions may not experience temperatures that are close to their upper limits, whereas plants from the equatorial regions and the mid-latitude regions will likely experience temperatures that are very close and sometimes above the upper limits of their tolerance. Shown here are some results for Indian tropical tree species that from a study that was conducted in my lab. We looked at temperature tolerance in 40 tropical tree species from this region and found that there was wide variation in the temperatures, the upper limits of temperatures that these different trees could sustain, from approximately 45 degrees on the lower end to greater than 50 degrees for trees that were more temperature tolerant. What's interesting is that if we compare these upper limits to the predicted temperatures in the next 100 years, the estimates are 3 to 6 degrees, and if we take the upper limit of 6 degrees, we see that half of these species will actually be experiencing temperatures in future climates that are greater than their upper thermal limits. The other half, while their upper thermal limits might be greater, are very close to the extreme temperatures that we might experience in future climates. Just for you to understand what these different species are, the most sensitive species in this study was actually Tectona grande species. There is the peepal tree somewhere over there, which is also fairly sensitive, tamarind, which is right in the middle, neem, the Ficus religiosa, banyan tree, and on the extreme right hand side in this group of 40 species, the one that was most tolerant was actually mango. So it's good to know that future climates, mango will still continue to do pretty well and we'll still have our favorite fruit. This study and other studies associated with this have shown that tropical trees from India are very close to the upper thermal limits. The thermal limits of tropical trees from India are very close to the temperatures that they're likely to experience in future climates. Our results also showed, importantly, that deciduous and fast-growing species may be more negatively affected by these increased temperatures and also drought, and that this will likely lead to directional changes in the composition of future forests in this region, which will favor relatively slower growing and evergreen species. This is particularly important because such changes in species composition can also alter important atmosphere vegetation feedbacks, which could further exacerbate global warming. More recent studies have been stressing that it's important to go beyond looking at just single species and also understand how interactions of species are going to be altered in future climates with global warming. A study in alpine meadows looked at how competition between plants interacts with global warming, and they found that the negative effects of competition were exacerbated when global warming occurs with new competitors. So as you can see here, the dark red bar shows warmer climates with new competitors, and all of those were the highest reductions in 4 different plant species as compared to warmer climates with current competitors or current climate and competition. A recent study looked at and summarized all of the different effects of global warming on biological systems, and they show that the effects of global warming are pervasive. They change processes significantly at all levels of biological organization, going from genetics and physiology, morphology and phenology, to population dynamics and species distributions, ultimately interspecific relationships and properties of ecosystems. We now recognize that this is a multifaceted problem, and we need to understand at least these 6 different key biological mechanisms and the interactions between them to fully appreciate the effects of global warming on biological systems and species and ultimately ecosystems. These are starting with the physiology, which is ultimately going to affect the population demography, range distributions, species interactions, and over time the evolution of species and the environment. So with this quick introduction to the biological and ecological impacts of global warming, I'm going to stop with this quote from the paper that I just showed you a couple of slides ago by Scheffers et al., which came out 2 years ago, which says that humanity depends on intact functioning ecosystems for a range of goods and services. The enhanced understanding of the observed impacts of climate change on core ecological processes is an essential first step to adapting to them and mitigating their influence on biodiversity and ecosystem service provisioning. Thank you.